As we administer our program, it's important to bear in mind that the Information Security Program Manager must keep aware of the differences in perceptions of cultures and what is considered appropriate or inappropriate as it applies to those cultures. This is a good opportunity for the Information Security Manager to work strongly with the Human Resource Department. The next aspect of overall program management when it comes to the administrative activities is the subject of logistics. Logistical issues must be addressed effectively, and particularly given the significant amount of interaction with the other business units that the entire program is going to require. Things like cross-organizational strategic planning and execution, project and task management, development of schedules of regularly performed procedures all require good logistical identification. This is why today's Information Security Manager is wearing so many hats. They have to perform information security liaison responsibilities, incident response responsibilities, compliance monitoring and enforcement, assignment of risks and impact, and overall security review and audits. Now, an organization's information technology department is probably one of the most critical roles within the organization. However, you must be mindful of the inherent conflicts of interest that can occur between the information technology department and the information security department. Remembering that we often ask our information technology specialists to perform competing tasks to ensure that the policies and standards are being met, while all at the same time ensuring that the performance and efficiency is being addressed. Sometimes it's hard to separate the core competency of an information technology department to design, deploy, and operate the systems, because today we've tossed additional duties onto them, such as auditing and monitoring responsibilities of those technical assets. That brings us to the business unit managers themselves. That they are considered the front line of all business operations. And as it applies to our requirements, this is where the Information Security Manager engages the development process of any products or services related to the organization's informational resources. Who better to ask and engage than the individual unit managers themselves? Very often, whenever I accept an assignment into a new organization, often before I even meet my immediate contact, I will ask where the legal department is, because ultimately, they're the ones that are going to protect the organization and me from legal liability. Now let's look at our employees themselves. The employee does serve as that first line of defense when it comes to information security. Once properly trained, it is the responsibility of all employees to follow the standards and policies that we've put in place. However, one of the things that's often overlooked is the ability for our employees, now that they're properly and expertly trained, to identify and bring us suggestions for improvement. Remember, this is a team activity. No one person or one department can do it by themselves. We need the involvement of everybody every day. And because it's a team function, everybody needs to pitch in. The Information Security Manager can set clear policy and assist in overall process coordination, but all areas must assist in providing oversight to the program as a whole. This can absolutely be seen when it comes to incident response. The organization's ability to quickly identify and contain incidents can make all the difference between success and bankruptcy. A few of the methods that's often used to, for instance, identify some of these security incidents are through some of the reviews and audits of COBIT, NIST, and the ISO standards. All of our security audits and reviews have set scopes and objectives. They also have constraints, as well as systematic approaches as to how they receive their individual results. The effectiveness of the controls are really judged by whether or not the controls have been met or are being met as intended. That brings us to overall compliance monitoring and enforcement. Compliance enforcement really has two parts, the regulatory part and the internal part. Maintaining compliance with all state and federal regulations is a consideration that every organization must face every day. But there are many decisions that an organization must face when it comes to internal matters and how they're going to handle enforcement and discipline to those policies and standards that we put in place on a more personal level. Here's a list of some sources many organizations use to identify a specific vulnerability in their organizations. A personal favorite of mine are the CVEs and the SANS organization. Next, let's talk about Care and Due Diligence. Due diligence is essentially a term that is related to the notion of a standard of due care. However, they are very different. There are parties that practice due diligence, and then there are parties that practice due care. The whole idea behind due care is centered around what's called the prudent person rule. Essentially, would another individual of like mind, background, and capability make the same decision that you did? If you find that that would be the case, then it can be indicated that a prudent person would have acted in the same manner in which you did. The methods that we employ when it comes to due diligence are the fact that we continue to do periodic risk assessments, we have effective backup and recovery processes for the organization, we have effective monitoring and matrix for our security program, and we have tested business continuity and disaster recovery plans. These are all critical elements when it comes to due diligence. Because our networks have become very wide and expansive, and in fact we have outsourced many services, we also need to take into consideration those third parties and how they are acting and behaving within their organizations, and are they adversely affecting ours by their action. Now, it's understood that there are numerous threats that exist that are going to impact our security program. That's why a dogged approach to continuous assessment should be undertaken. However, we often find that even the assessment of risk within organizations really isn't giving the whole picture. Oftentimes, the assessment objectives are unclear, or there isn't a definite strategy on how the assessment should have been performed. And most often, they're being performed with very poor planning and absolutely inadequate resources. Next, let's take a look at basic vulnerability analysis. The idea behind vulnerability analysis is just simply to identify whether the vulnerability exists. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is risk to every vulnerability. It's simply identifying that there's some characteristic within the system that allows a threat to occur if executed. By performing comprehensive vulnerability analysis, it allows us to expose the existence of these vulnerabilities, so then we can take into account as to whether or not we expend resource to fix them. But again, neither of these things can really be properly executed without that BIA, the Business Impact Assessment. It's there to identify what happens if we lose the support of any one of our critical resources. Within that BIA is where we're going to find our resource dependency. By performing a full systems view, we find the resource dependency. We call that resource dependency analysis. We identify whether this machine is critically dependent on that machine to perform an overall function. A good example of this might be SharePoint. SharePoint is often just looked at as a piece of software that we point and click, and it takes us to a pretty page, but often it's overlooked the many different aspects that go into making SharePoint work, like Exchange and domain services. Through dependency analysis, it's uncovered that SharePoint is dependent on those other resources. So as I mentioned before, we're often outsourcing a lot of our services. Now, it's important to understand that there is a difference between outsourcing and service contracting. When I do service contracting, I, as the information security manager, retain ownership and responsibility for the overall performance of that particular service. When I outsource holistically the entire service itself. This is most notable when it comes to cloud computing. There are lots of definitions out there when it comes to cloud computing and what it is and how it's performed. Yes, you can have community clouds and public clouds and hybrid clouds and private clouds, but the service itself, what is it? The basic definition that seems to be most accepted comes from NIST, which simply identifies cloud computing as a model for enabling convenient on-demand network network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources. So let's make sure that you continue to understand these core definitions, especially when it comes to controls and countermeasures. Controls, remember, defined as the policies, procedures, practices, and guidelines designed to provide reasonable assurance that business objectives will be achieved, whereas countermeasures directly reduce a threat or vulnerability. I know they sound the same, but there is a slight difference. When we break out into these control categories, there are several of them to identify whether or not a control is a deterrent control or a preventative control. Perhaps we're using corrective or compensating controls or detective controls. It's important to understand the difference between each and when is the right opportunity to use them.